Hello and welcome to this OECD webinar with me, Duncan Crawford. Thank you so much for joining us. Today we're discussing how to effectively tackle bullying. Whether it's physical, verbal, online or in person, bullying remains a major issue in many places around the world, and the impact is far-reaching. Emotional harm, the fear to go to school, social isolation, mental health issues, negative impacts on learning, and even the risk of dropping out of education altogether are just some of the devastating possible consequences. The OECD's just released a new paper called Bullying in Education, Prevalence, Impact and Responses Across Countries. It highlights where bullying is most widespread and which student groups are most at risk of bullying. We're going to have a discussion about that with a panel in a moment, and also about how to effectively tackle bullying in schools. But first up, let's hear from OECD Research Associate Julia Pereira, who's going to give some of the highlights from this new OECD paper on bullying. Julie, over to you.
Thanks, Duncan. Hi, everyone. So let me share my slides. Yeah, I hope everyone can see them. So my name is Julie. I'm a research associate here at the OECD, and I'll be setting the scene today by giving you a brief overview of this new paper that I encourage everyone to read before we can dive into the panel discussion. So, so first, what exactly are we talking about? Defining bullying clearly is essential if we want to analyze the phenomenon and shape effective policy response. So usually traditional definitions of school bullying have emphasized individual psychology, highlighting elements such as the intention to harm. So for instance, this classic work from Olveus defined bullying as a repeated intentional aggression within a relationship marked by power imbalance. However, bullying is increasingly recognized as a broader social process now. So in this paper, we used the new definition from the UNESCO, which embraces this broader framing and defines bullying as a damaging social process that is characterized by an imbalance of power driven by social norms. So this shift from an individual intent to the social norms that sustain harmful power dynamics is necessary if we want to address the root causes of school bullying. The three key elements that remain across definition are the harm, the repetition of this harm, and the imbalance of power. However, bullying can take a multitude of different forms. It can be social, relational, it can be verbal, physical, and also includes cyberbullying. And cyberbullying can simply be defined as bullying with the use of digital technologies. So now that we've set a few definitions, let's look at the scope of this phenomenon with these recent prevalence estimates. So even though international assessments are not directly comparable, the data that I show here suggests that bullying prevalence ranges from 9% to 46% of students. So you see that these numbers vary quite a bit depending on the measurement methods that are used. And without diving too much into specifics, the more direct the questioning, that is, if we ask a direct question, are you bullied at school, the lower the prevalence. And conversely, the more specific behaviors are included in the question, the higher the prevalence. If we also add to these numbers the bystanders, that is, students who are witnessing bullying without taking part directly, we find that even more students are exposed to bullying, hence the importance of tackling it. In this paper, rather than relying on a binary variable that would categorize students as either bullied or not bullied based on a threshold, we built a bullying intensity index from 6 PISA questions, so being excluded, being made fun of, being threatened, having belongings taken, being hit or pushed, and having nasty rumors spread about them. And then we summed the responses to this question, producing an index ranging from 0 to 18 that captures gradations of exposure. And why is this important? Well, that's because the literature has shown that outcomes of bullying typically worsen as the intensity of the bullying increases. So in this paper, we are able to capture a bit this intensity. The first finding is a rather reassuring one, if we want, is that while most students experience some situation that can constitute bullying, only a small minority is confronted to very severe and intense bullying. So here we see that in 2022, about 45% of students had never or almost never experienced bullying, while 40 had a score between 1 and 5, and only 2% scored above 10. The second finding is when we compare average bullying intensity across countries, we notice that there is substantial heterogeneity. For example, in 2022, the average bullying intensity was 5 times higher in Latvia than in Korea. And then if we compare this intensity across time, over time, we find that across the majority of OECD and accession countries, bullying intensity has increased between 2015 and 2018, and then decreased between 2018 and 2022. We hypothesize that this decrease is likely linked to the COVID-19 pandemic. And while we do not yet have PISA 2025 data, the analysis of TEAMS 2023 suggests that there could be a post-pandemic rebound with bullying levels potentially rising above pre-pandemic levels. So we need to keep an eye on this. And then we also notice that Korea and Japan on the very left of this graph, they stand out as notable exceptions because they're the only one who experienced a steady decline in bullying intensity between 2015 and 2022. Then our third finding is that using this bullying intensity index, we also find, and it's no surprise, that not all student groups are equally likely to experience bullying. Our analysis indicates that students with an immigrant background tend to be more at risk of bullying than their native peers, particularly among advantaged students and among boys. So for instance, among disadvantaged students, boys with an immigrant background score 11% higher than native girls, and this difference is almost 6 times higher among advantaged students. So now that we've seen some prevalence facts, let us turn to the consequences of bullying. In the short term, there is clear and consistent evidence that students who experience bullying report higher rates of anxiety and depressive symptoms. These associations are substantial and likely causal. Experiencing bullying is also associated with somatic complaints and risky behaviors, which are themselves likely to be linked to increased depression and anxiety. Children and adolescents who are bullied face higher risk of sleep difficulties, headaches, other types of pains, and they're also more likely to be overweight or obese and have higher risk of substance use. The evidence also points to lower academic achievements for students who experience bullying. This negative impact is probably mediated by psychological difficulty. So in other words, bullying harms mental health, which in turn undermines learning through elements such as reduced motivation, reduced engagement, and lower self-confidence, for example. In the longer term, numerous studies report association between having been bullied in the past and adverse outcomes later in life, but the causality is still under debate. On the health side, bullying during childhood has been associated with poorer mental health during teenage years and in adulthood. And economically, it's been associated with higher rates of unemployment, lower wages, and lower savings. There is also some evidence that children and adolescents who engaged in bullying have higher risks of committing crimes later in life. These individual consequences aggregate and are thus also visible at the school level. So higher bullying prevalence is notably associated with poorer school climate and lower average sense of belonging, which are both strongly linked to students' academic performance. And even bystanders also appear to experience negative consequences of bullying. So for example, school-wide bullying levels are negatively correlated with students' sense of belonging, even among the students who are not directly involved in bullying. And finally, at the society level, we do find societal costs associated with bullying, and they typically fall into 2 main categories. So on the one side, healthcare costs, and on the other side, productivity loss, which take two forms. The first one is when parents miss work to care for their children who are affected by bullying. And in the longer term, the second form is the reduced productivity through reduced educational attainment and lower employment among individuals who were bullied during childhood or teenage years. So how do we tackle bullying? How do we act? I'm going to go a bit quickly on this part because I already talked quite a bit, and also because our panelists, I know they will bring very interesting responses to this question. But I'm going to summarize the 4 levers that can be used to reduce bullying. So first, governance. Effective bullying strategy, anti-bullying strategies start with clear regulatory frameworks that provide a shared definition of bullying, that establish legal sanctions, and that assign responsibilities across actors. Governance measures can also be connected to the curriculum. So for example, by embedding social-emotional skills as a part of the core learning. The second lever is capacity development. So teacher, school staff, school leaders, they need specific training to be equipped with the knowledge and skills necessary to identify, prevent, and respond effectively to bullying situations. Capacity development also means mobilizing the right professionals, such as psychologists, counselors, to make sure that their action is coordinated with that of the school. Third, we have educational interventions. So the most promising approaches within educational interventions are whole school and whole community approaches. So those approaches that involve all stakeholders. And the literature also show that effective interventions rely on clear anti-bullying rules and procedures. And finally, the last lever would be monitoring and evaluations. So systems need tools to assess bullying prevalence both at the system level and at the schools level to be able to follow bullying trends and see what is working and what is not working. If we disaggregate this data by gender, socioeconomic background, and other relevant characteristics, we are then able to improve potentially equity by knowing who is most affected and acting accordingly. And finally, it's important that whenever we implement specific interventions, we evaluate both their impact and their implementation to be sure that what we are doing is efficient. So I'm going to stop here and open the panel.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Julie. Very interesting indeed. And thank you to everyone who's joining us on this webinar. I see the chat is already getting busy. Please do send in any questions you have for Julie or indeed for our panel. Seeing as I've mentioned our panel, I might as well introduce them. Let's get this underway. Joining us on the panel today, Professor James O'Higgins Norman, who is based at Dublin City University, where he's also director of the DCU Anti-Bullying Centre, and he is also the UNESCO Chair on Bullying and Cyberbullying. Thank you for joining us, James. Oana Felecan, a policy officer at the European Commission in the Directorate-General for Education, Youth, Sport and Culture, joins us as well. Hello to you. And Lisen Bergqvist, head of advocacy at the Swedish anti-bullying organisation Friends, is also joining us on the panel today. Welcome to all of our panellists. To kick things off, Professor James O'Higgins Norman, I think I'm going to start with you. You obviously speak about bullying regularly to policymakers, to schools, to teachers. Some of the findings just mentioned there in that new OECD paper, how does it tally with other research you're familiar with, in particular on the disproportionate likelihood that students are going to be bullied more if they're boys from an immigrant background and from an advantaged background, like a high socioeconomic status?
Yep, pretty much the patterns remain the same around the globe. Those who are bullied are more likely to be those who are male and who are seen to be on the fringe of the main group, whether it's because of their gender, sexual orientation, social class, whatever it might be. Body size is also another one that comes through a lot in the research. So what Julie took us through there in terms of the findings she reported are pretty typical of research everywhere. That pattern doesn't seem to change. It points to the underlying social processes that empower bullying behavior. Those who are already marginalized or who feel they're on the edge of society, on the edge of our education system, tend to be the ones who are victimized most.
Thank you for that. Oana Felecan from the European Commission, if I can bring you in. We're talking about how to effectively tackle bullying. What, in your view, are the core components of an effective anti-bullying strategy?
Thanks a lot, Duncan. So just maybe a word of introduction from the European Commission perspective. We have been working with anti-bullying policies from some time now, initially quite fragmented and a lot through the lens of, addressing early school leaving, classroom management, and so on. But in light of the COVID pandemic and the impact on mental health, and also in relation to decreasing results at school, since 2022, we have been taking a much more integrating approach to address bullying, and much more focused on preventative approach, and an approach which focus on comprehensive attention to well-being and mental health, starting with positive school climate, but also intervention policies and anti-bullying policies at school. So really, in a whole system perspective that Julie was also rightfully mentioned in her slide, and involving the whole community, but also the whole the entire school community, but also parents and other centers or expertise that is around the school. Now, most recently, and here it's a bit the latest, the newest development from our side, but it should be seen in complementarity to these previous approaches, is to zoom in on cyberbullying, because this, we have been increasingly seeing it as a societal problem, and also evidence starts to show that it has specific characteristics, although that the underlying processes and also the triggering factors, especially if we look from the school perspective, remain the same as the bullying. It has some specific characteristics that should be taken on board, but also from the perspective of how we can help schools and the other actors act upon. So here it's a lot how to keep the children safe online. So the most recent initiative at European Commission level, it's an action plan against cyberbullying. I'd be happy to say more on this later on.
Okay, thank you for that. I was going to ask about cyberbullying later, but as you mention it, let's turn to one of our guests, Lisa Berquist from the NGO Friends, and I'll ask you about cyberbullying. What was just said there, apparently it's being seen increasingly as more of a societal problem. Is that something you're seeing in Sweden as well?
Cyberbullying as a societal problem and not specifically to youth, is that what you're asking?
What I understood was just said there, unless I'm misquoting Oana, she was saying from the European Commission perspective that they're seeing it increasingly as a societal problem, and I'm wondering if you agree with that.
Well, I think that we see bullying as a societal problem, and that we don't differ between cyberbullying and bullying. It's the same definition, it just takes place in different arenas. And we have been discussing this regarding the European Commission's action plan as well, which is very tech specific because it's coming from that perspective. But what we do see is that children don't separate these, whether they're in school or in their digital environment, and we just have to address bullying as a phenomenon on its as a whole.
Understood. Just to follow up quickly, do you see any positive trends then at the moment in how schools and wider society in Sweden or elsewhere are tackling bullying?
Unfortunately, I would say that the trend is not positive, because what we see in many countries right now are the cell phone bans, for example, and how they are promoted as being a quick fix to cyberbullying. But the regular bullying stays on. So we see that it's not actually a response to cyberbullying or bullying to have phone bans, for example, or to have social media age limits. So I think that what we're experiencing right now is that there are a lot of politicians that want to make a strong point and ban phones, and it's taking resources from where we need them to be with social emotional learning and preventative work. So that was not a positive trend, that was a negative trend. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. If I bring Julie back in from the OECD, again on trends, and I don't know if the OECD does have data on this, has social media made bullying worse? Have we done any tracking on that? Has it been easier to bully other children?
So unfortunately, from the OECD data, from the PISA data, we do not distinguish whether the bullying happens online or in schools or somewhere else. So I'm not really able to provide an answer specifically regarding this. What I want to stress is that there is a significant overlap in terms of students who are bullied, whether online or cyberbullied. So research has shown, for example, that I think it was 2/3 of students who are cyberbullied are also bullied in real life. So I would see social media as like another way, another place, if you will, in which the bullying happens, and that obviously that's terrible, but I don't think it's so different.
James, what's your view on this? If I bring you back in, do you think there are specific steps which should be taken to deal with cyberbullying, which are different to dealing with bullying more in general?
I think, yeah, I'm glad we're talking about this. We need to recognize that children, like adults today, live blended lives. And when we talk about cyberbullying, it kind of creates this concept of something that's happening separate to somewhere else. As Leeson has already highlighted, bullying is a process, a social process that can occur anywhere. So while there might be, as Oana has rightly says, particulars to when somebody is being bullied online, they're no more, I think, to be considered than, say, particulars when somebody's being bullied in school or at home or in the community. These are the places where the bullying is occurring, and we need to, look at those places and what we can do to make them safer. But we need to really have a more fundamental approach, which recognizes that children and adolescents live blended lives, and that unfortunately, some of those blended lives will encounter bullying. We know from research that somewhere between 80 to 97% of those who are bullied online are also bullied offline. And so that tells us something about how we need to approach this. To the extent that I actually myself don't like using the term cyberbullying anymore, even though it's in my job title, I prefer to talk about bullying online and offline, because I think cyberbullying tends to develop a more technological association with bullying, which isn't really the full picture.
Okay, understood. I'm going to bring Oana Felecan back in from the European Commission, because as she mentioned, they've just launched a specific action plan about cyberbullying, tackling cyberbullying. And I'm wondering what the European Commission is doing, how that tallies with some of the recommendations which James just suggested there.
So yeah, first of all, let me stress that from the education perspective, we fully support this approach of importance of bullying and the underlying processes, how prevention it starts, the role of social-emotional education, the role of well-being policies in school as a mission, as a value of the school that is vehiculated and transmitted throughout the whole school processes. However, how should I say, the complementarity, I would say, with cyberbullying is that, and here I will place in the chat also a wide research that colleagues from the Joint Research Center have put together, and where they looked at the specificities of cyberbullying. it also realizes that it has specific characteristics that go beyond. It does not mean it's different. It does not mean that the starting processes are not the same, but some elements are particular. And here we can speak about the medium. Of course, it happens in the digital world, but by the fact of being that can be anonymous, by the fact that only one repetition, one post can generate really a lot of repetition, it remains online. And it also, in addition to vulnerable groups, also in traditional bullying, also the digital competencies or the lack of digital competencies and digital media literacy can also represent a protective or a risk factor if we have it or not. So from this perspective, this is one angle to take into account the specificities and to complement. But also there is the characteristic that it's happening much less also under adult supervision. And also schools rightfully say we cannot know anything or we might not know when this happens. So hence the importance also to involve the parents, but also to make to work with the platforms to make them accountable, and also to make reporting or cases when happens easier. So it's from this perspective, I consider it's complementary to the work on bullying, not necessarily, how should I say, that we are looking at two different definitions.
Thank you for that. Let me bring back in Lisa Bergquist from the Friends NGO. A number of points made there, and it's something which Julie actually mentioned in her presentation, where she talked about a whole school approach, and other people talk about whole community approaches. What does that look like in practice? And in your view, is anyone anywhere getting this right?
Thank you for giving that question to me. We often talk about Ireland as a front runner here, so I'll be happy to turn over to James after this. But I could say that what we as an organization talk mostly about is mapping and monitoring. It's the first step of a whole school approach to be sure that we know what the children are experiencing, and exactly as Julie said, that we need to ask them very specific questions on behaviors and not just whether they've been bullied or not, because it's also a stigma. And coming from that, if we do have these mapping tools in place, we can also advise schools on how to or what interventions to make. So, yeah.
Okay, well, you told me to ask Professor James O'Higgins Norman about this, so I'm going to take your advice. James, whole school approaches, are there any particular strategies out there which you would recommend others focusing on and learning from?
Yeah, thanks, Duncan and Lisa, for setting me up like that. So what I would say is that we have for about 30 years talked about whole school approaches, and there is a benefit, of course, to seeing a school as a system and how we can introduce and affect change across the system. But we realized in more recent years that schools are actually each individual school is part of a wider system and a society. So over the last few years, with the work that UNESCO has been leading with the World Anti-Bullying Forum and ourselves, we have developed what we call a whole education approach. And Julie, in her report that she reported there, actually summarized the 9 aspects of a whole education approach in 4 pillars there, which is actually shows how she's much more efficient than we were when we came up with our 9 dimensions to the whole education approach. But that whole education approach realizes that each individual school sits within a system, and that system is influenced by national leadership, local community context, the impact of social media companies, student voice and agency, the curriculum and how it's developed, and a number of different things. And none of these is more important than the other. the other aspects, all of them need equal attention. And so I would point to that whole education approach from UNESCO. In Ireland, we developed the action plan on bullying in 2022, our national action plan, which is called Cináltas, which is the Irish word for kindness. And we framed that action plan within the UNESCO whole education approach. And that is certainly colouring how we're approaching things here in Ireland. And like Leeson said, monitoring is a big part of that. But leadership at a national, a local, and a school level is also very important. So is student voice and co-design. So any strategy that needs to be wants to be effective needs to be developed in tandem with student voice and student agency as at the centre of it as well.
Thank you so much for that. At the risk of repeating myself, Julie Pereira, I'm going to come to you on this. A question from Teresa from Slovakia, and it is basically about what we were just talking about. What are some of the most effective whole school interventions or programs that help prevent bullying? In your view, Julie, are there any specific aspects which are more effective than others?
Thank you for the question. Well, it's difficult to measure, and also an intervention efficiency depends on the baseline level of bullying. So in general, meta-analysis have shown that any interventions is better than nothing, basically. But then obviously it depends on the specific features of this intervention and then on the baseline prevalence. The most effective features of interventions are this whole school aspect, so involving every stakeholders, involving family, parents, involving teachers and staff. Then a second feature that was recognized as being particularly effective is having clear bullying, anti-bullying rules and clear procedures, so that we don't leave what to do on one single adult, basically. So children and adolescents need to know what to expect in case a bullying situation occur. And then in terms of specific interventions, there are plenty that have been proven effective, and they don't all rely on the same principles. We can cite, for example, Kiva, a Finnish initiative, a well-known initiative. There's also the Olveus anti-bullying prevention program, and No Trap, an Italian one that is also good. But I'm only citing those because they have been assessed with very strong methodologies, but I'm sure there are plenty other initiatives, as long as they embrace this whole school, whole education approach and don't rely on single elements too much.
Thank you for that. I'm wondering, and Oana Felecan from the European Commission, I'm going to bring you back in on this, because we saw in one of the charts, which Julie showed us in her presentation, there are different levels of bullying in different countries. In Japan and Korea, it's much lower. In other countries, it is much higher. And when you're assessing how EU countries are doing on this, do you see that countries who have a greater extent of bullying, where bullying is a more common issue, do you see that they're not doing as much in terms of implementing whole school approaches, anti-bullying strategies as other countries?
In fact, to be honest, we do not have comparative data on this at the moment, because as I told you, the lens, a lot of lens were also through the policies on inclusive education. But as we have been working a lot with well-being and mental health in the recent years, and the guidelines that we developed both for policymakers and the schools advocate for this holistic approach with the introduction of social-emotional learning throughout the curriculum, also anti-bullying plans made of the whole school, the school capacity, quality assurance systems, also the capacity building that Julie was mentioning. This is also advocating for. So we are now in the process. So in the last years, we have developed some specific tools to add help policymakers and schools to develop these approaches. We also have self-assessment tools for school. And now we are looking with Eurydice, but this report will be available next year, to see how the countries have been, in fact, developing frameworks to successfully implement whole school approaches to well-being and mental health. So we expect to have this data by next year.
Okay, thank you for that. There are lots of questions coming in on the chat, and I apologize, I haven't asked many so far, but I'm going to do it now, and it's going to be a bit of a hodgepodge of questions. So just to warn the panel, it's a bit of a scatter round, put it that way. Professor James O'Higgins Norman, if I can come to you first. Davina, a teacher, has written in asking, what intervention would you recommend for secondary students who have been bullied but don't want it reported?
Yeah, well, I think that's a really good question, because that occurs a lot in schools, and I think we have to balance the students' paying attention to the students' fears against our responsibilities as adults with the duty of care towards those children. So a lot of that, at the time when that situation arises, a lot of confidence building has to occur with the student who has been bullied and who doesn't want it reported, and bringing them on a journey whereby they realize that we'll identify together who else needs to know about this so that it will stop. Because ultimately what that child wants is no fuss, but the bullying to stop. So it's about building confidence with that child, and hopefully being able to bring them with you in terms of understanding that they don't have to feel this way, and that they can be helped. And really, that means drawing on our skills as educators. Every teacher has those skills. It's just developing a relationship with the child, building their confidence, and then together with the child, planning out on what the next step will be. Not rushing in as if we are kind of like, a fire brigade coming in to fix the problem. They need to come on the journey with us and feel that they have a say in each step of that journey.
Thank you for that. Lisa Berquist from the NGO Friends, a question here from Fernando from Brazil, who writes in saying, how can schools deal with bullying suffered by high ability or gifted children? What are the possible strategies?
Can you take the question again?
How can schools deal with bullying which is suffered by children who have high ability or they're gifted children? What strategies would you recommend to deal with that kind of specific bullying, targeting those specific?
Yeah, I don't have any strategies for that specific group. I think that, and the rest of you, you're very welcome to join the conversation. I think that that it's more of a universal work where we work with the children with the same strategies, no matter why they are subjected to bullying. But what I would like, I'm just going to steal some time here and also answer to another question regarding the whole school approach. And because I also saw that there were questions in the chat regarding parents and, that sometimes schools can feel like they have all the responsibility and parents don't. So I just want to highlight that involving the parents is a very important part of the whole school approach, to make sure that parents and the school, that they are aligned and that they all take responsibility for working against bullying.
Thank you for that.
Just on the gifted question there, Duncan, sorry, just to say that the research does show that children who have high academic ability are often more prone to being bullied, but it's the same issue whether the child has a different sexual orientation or is from a lower socioeconomic background. It's about difference. So the more we can address the underlying social process by helping our students to celebrate difference and understand each child's difference, then the less likely there are children who are different are going to be bullied. But there is also another aspect to this, particularly when children have a learning, let's say additional needs, such as if they're on the autism spectrum. And sometimes those children who have high ability may have challenges when it comes to their social interactions with children, with other children, other students in the school. So some work needs to be done maybe sometimes with the individual child, but also with the wider group around what we value, particularly in terms of diversity.
Thank you for that, Fernando. I think your question has been well answered. Here's a question from Arja from the European Parents Association, and I think it's probably best to direct this one at Oana from the European Commission, because it is about cyberbullying. And she writes, Arja, do you think that banning social media for under 16-year-olds will improve the situation of cyberbullying?
This is one of the hottest topics at the moment. I would say I can have a reply as a representative of the European Commission and a reply as a parent also. But no, it's really a lot. I mean, we are noticing this trend, and many countries are starting to go this direction. This is a prerogative of the member states. The Commission has put together, and is also under the leadership of DG Connect, an expert group which will come up with recommendations. But what we have been advocating also from the perspective of digital education to build the digital literacy, digital skills. But what we have been also advocating from the mental health perspective, it's really to interact with these tools with cautious, and it's very important to link it and be aware of the child developmental age. Just banning personally, I don't think it will solve the issues, but as a parent, I'm very much in favor of delaying it as much as possible, while also building the competencies necessary to deal with it when children are online.
Thank you so much for that. I saw some people on the panel nodding, so they clearly agree with you. Julie from the OECD, if I can bring you back in, a question from Esther from Switzerland, who says, do the panel have do's and don'ts in terms of early interventions in school bullying cases? I don't know if the OECD does have recommendations on this. Do you have a thought on this, do's and don'ts in terms of early interventions?
I guess like we as adults should be very careful to early warning signs, because they are early warning signs in terms of bullying, to detect bullying early. And those warning signs can be quite subtle. It's mostly about changes. So changes in attendance, in performance, in mood. Those can alert the adults around to be careful whether something is going wrong. And then in terms of early intervention, so it involves necessarily early detection. I think there's a fine balance between having a universal prevention approach for everyone, and that can be quite an early intervention before the bullying even occurs or before it was detected, and then having some targeted measures for students that need it. I hope this answered the question.
Thank you very much. I thought it was a very good effort. It's certainly better than anything I could say. James, if I can bring you back in, Professor James O'Higgins Norman, there's a question from Carolina, who writes in saying, how should you handle disciplining the bully and helping the victim if bullying happens during class time without spending too much time on it?
So I think if I understand the question correctly, it's like, are we imagining a teacher in a situation in the classroom where they're observing? Well, first of all, I'd say well done to the teacher for observing it, because quite often that isn't the case. And then secondly, I would say, as in all good classroom management textbooks will tell you, to de-escalate the situation as much as you can, and to try and take those who are impacted on it out of that situation, because dealing with it in front of the rest of the class probably won't go down too well either. I would follow up afterwards. I contain it within the classroom, and I would follow up afterwards then with the individuals involved, and then try to understand what's going on and help it. But really, if you're a teacher and you're in charge of a classroom, your duty is to make sure everyone in that room is safe. If you ultimately feel somebody isn't safe, then I would remove whoever needs to be removed from the classroom until you can deal with it later on in a very pastoral and holistic way. I would prefer to not use the word discipline. I'd prefer to say to respond rather than to react to it.
Thank you for that insight. Leeson from the NGO Friends. How often do you see this? Because James just mentioned it. He said teachers don't always notice the bullying. And I'm wondering, when you're speaking to people who are being affected by bullying, is this something that you hear about a lot, that teachers aren't noticing bullying?
think, first of all, it's, I think that not most people, but we have different perceptions of what bullying is. So we also have to remind ourselves that it's not always visible. It's that you might not be part of the group. It's not that someone is actually physically hitting you. So there are different dimensions to bullying, which is can be harder to notice as a teacher. It could also be different people working within the classroom and outside the classroom. So it could also be hard to see these patterns because what's going on inside the classroom might not transfer, or you might not notice, the same people are not noticing the full line of what is happening. So I think that there is, at least in Sweden, we have less school staff right now working, and we can also see that with budget cuts and in personnel, it also gets harder to notice bullying and prevent bullying, and also take measures against bullying if you have less school staff.
Thank you for that. On the subject of teachers, maybe Oana, Felecan, you can answer this one. What can we do to ensure children feel able to come forward and speak to teachers about it if they are feeling bullied and if they're feeling pressured that they can't speak to someone about it? Are there any specific policy recommendations that you'd like to share on that situation?
Well, I would say the first thing is the confidence that the teacher inspires, but in order also for teacher to feel competent in addressing these issues, and as it was also mentioned previously, to be able to notice it and to know how to respond, these issues should be integrated in teacher professional development and in initial teacher education and training. Young teachers should come prepared nowadays with tools that enable them to understand and to address this situation. But also, most importantly, it's also the school culture support from leadership, and also the networks that exist in schools among the teachers themselves, the supporting networks, but also with other professionals that are around the schools to help. And I'm thinking here of nurses, psychologists, and other types of professions. So indeed, the school must be equipped with all these profiles nowadays.
Thank you for that. James, I think this question probably is best one given to you. Should schools have a staff member, a specific person who is responsible for tackling bullying in their schools?
Yes, we would always recommend that somebody has an assigned role, a member of staff, an assigned role as, sometimes we would call them anti-bullying coordinators. In Ireland, under our National Action Plan on Bullying, we have wellbeing coordinators in every school, and so it falls within their brief. But somebody should have the job in a school of monitoring and coordinating and animating the school's response to school bullying. One of the things that across all research forever that we see coming through all of the time is that a positive school climate is related to lower prevalence of bullying. And also it increases the chances of students becoming positive bystanders. If they feel they're in an environment where staff take these things seriously and respond well, students themselves are more likely to respond well to incidents of bullying. So that is not going to happen by accident. That needs the leadership that Oana was just talking about there a moment ago, but it also needs someone in the school staff to be the person who animates that aspect of school climate. And because, the old saying, everybody's job becomes nobody's job. Well, this is a really important job. If you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, feeling safe is one of the very first things we need in a community, and a school is a community where everyone should feel safe. So having someone whose job it is to animate that aspect of school climate, I think, is really important.
Thank you very much for that. A comment here from Arja. She writes, very often children who are bullies were bullied themselves before, or are afraid of being bullied and bullying others as a kind of preventative measure. So working with family is essential to understand why a child is being bullied to ultimately stop it. And a related question really from Armanda has written in saying, what are the best approaches to working with the parents of bullies? How do you involve them? Are there any best practices? Lisa, or go on, James, if you
well, can I just say the first thing we need to do is stop calling them bullies, because that label is only going to compound whatever situation is there. And Arja has quite rightly described a particular type of child who might bully, maybe somebody who has been bullied themselves in the past. But the more we look at this space and the more research we do, the more we realize that there are lots of different reasons why a child might engage in bullying behavior. And so it will require different types of responses. So for example, if the bullying is taking place online, then that bullying may be happening because of a lack of digital literacy skills and an inability to know how to express oneself online. If it's happening in the classroom, it might be because maybe the teacher isn't creating an ordered classroom and students are responding to feeling out of control in a way that looks like bullying, and so on. So we need to really look at the cause, the underlying processes that are there, and then respond to those accordingly.
Thank you. And Lisa, over to you.
Yeah, and I would also like to highlight that it's not a two-dimensional thing. So it's not bully victim. It's actually a group phenomenon. And as we've talked about, how positive school climate is really important. It doesn't prevent all bullying from happening, but actually the roles of the bully and the victim, they change, and it's not, you cannot say that certain children are bullies. It changes with the dynamics, and it's also very important to highlight that you also have this double role of a bully victim that actually is both bullied themselves and also bully others. So.
Thank you for that. Julie from the OECD, a question here asking how schools can better monitor bullying more effectively. Are there any measures in that area that you would like to share?
Yeah, so it's very important to monitor also at the school level to just make sure whatever we're doing is working. But I think it's also hard to have schools design their own survey and everything. So I think this monitoring at the school level need to be supported and perhaps even implemented by the system level. So there are a few examples. For example, Greece has conducted in 2024 a national survey that is then distributed to each school. And France also does that once a year for every student. So the idea is that the survey and then the analysis of the survey should probably be done by other institutions. So it can be Ministry of Education or other system level actors. But then the schools need to be able to access those results to monitor the trends and know what's going on.
Thank you for that. Oana, Felecan, a related question from Yvonne, who's written in and asked, to what extent is it necessary to monitor bullying behaviour and or experiences as a victim in specific vulnerable subgroups, for instance, within small religious or ethnic groups? So to what extent is it necessary to monitor specific bullying behaviour aimed at specific groups?
Well, what we saw also in the beginning is that these are also among the groups which are most at risk of being bullied. But I think the monitoring should also, so at the school level, the school should monitor the policies that they have on well-being and safe environments, so preventing violence, being bullied, cyberbullying, but also gender-based violence or other type of violence. But then to also understand which are maybe the risk factors that can make one particular target group being more at risk or not. So it's from this perspective that should be the data should be disaggregated.
Thank you for that.
I also think that it probably differs between countries. I think we're here, we're looking at a global level, but we also come from very different settings. And I think that children with different ethnic backgrounds, that the statistics might show that but as James said in the beginning, it could also be LGBT, for example, but that's not something that you talk about in your society at all. It won't show up as one of the reasons why you're being bullied either. So it's all everything that makes you differ from the rest of the group. So
thank you for those remarks. There's a question here from someone called DZ Adriani, who's a teacher in a high school. And I'm going to open this to the panel. I'm not sure who's best to answer it. They write in saying the best ways to tackle bullying is during the early ages, they believe. And they write, is there any evidence that could work where you put more investment into tackling bullying in the early ages to try to prevent it later on?
Yeah, so I think that's really important. As early as possible, we start to develop social emotional skills in children so that they're less likely to engage in bullying behavior. They're better able to appreciate other people's differences, and they have levels of empathy that are a good base for good relationships. However, we need to remember we're talking about dynamic environments. We're not talking about laboratories. So in every school in the country, there's a changeover at least once a year, where there's new staff, new students, new curriculum, and so on. And all of these things influence the social processes that underpin that school. So just doing it all with, say, early childhood doesn't mean it won't occur later on, because we're dealing with a dynamic situation. It needs to be something that actually we pay attention to throughout the life cycle, from early childhood years all the way up to university.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm being made aware by my colleagues in the back room that we are close to running over time, so I need to wrap this up fairly soon. And I want to ask a final question for everyone here, which I fear I'm going to ask it, and you're all going to say, well, I can't answer that, I'll only give you one thing. But anyway, this is the question. If you were advising a school on how to respond to bullying, what would be the first thing you would recommend them to do? And that's not listing everything they have to do. What's the number one thing schools should consider if they want to more effectively tackle bullying? Oana, Felecan from the European Commission.
I would say to look at, to really discuss the norms and what they share as values in the school.
Okay. Leeson Berquist from Friends.
Yeah, this gives me an opportunity to talk about how Sweden also has really great legislation, which is also why we have had low numbers of bullying for several years. And it's because all schools needs to have an action plan against degrading treatment. And schools need to intervene already before it's bullying. So you have to act on every single degrading treatment. So I would also say in a global context that having that plan on every school, and also a team or a person that is responsible for these issues. Yeah.
Julie from the OECD, what's the first thing you'd recommend a school to do?
I'd say set the norms from the adult level, that bullying is not an inevitable feature of school life, and it's not a normal part of childhood and adolescence. And like setting the debate, setting the topic of bullying as something that we want to do something about is already a first good step.
Thank you so much. And James O'Higgins Norman, last word to you.
It's always hard to come last after all those great contributions and great ideas, but I would maybe take a step back, and I would look at teacher education. And I think Julie's right. We need to work with the adults. Leeson is right. We need to work on the values of the school and so on. But I think we tend to put all our focus on the students and how they're behaving and what they're doing. But actually, we need to look at ourselves as adults. And I would go back further and look at teacher education and the extent to which school climate, safe schools, bullying prevention are covered within teacher education programs. I don't think they get a lot of time. Mostly because over the last decade or two, we have been focused so much on STEM and literacy and numeracy that I think we've pushed out that part of the teacher education curriculum, and we've maybe taken it for granted a bit. So let's bring back in to teacher education all of this work that we can do around bullying prevention.
Thank you to all of our panelists. Lots to dwell on. To everyone who's been watching this webinar, if you are a policymaker or an education leader, there's some ideas for you to implement tomorrow morning. You've been listening to Professor James O'Higgins Norman from Dublin City University, Oana Felecan from the European Commission, Lisa Bergquist from the Swedish anti-bullying organisation Friends, and the OECD's very own Julie Pereira. Thank you to all our panelists for joining us today. Thank you to everyone who's been listening in, writing in their questions, and thank you to Kevin Gillespie behind the scenes, who leads the team, the technical team, which makes these webinars happen. If you want to learn more about this subject, then do go to the OECD website, check out the new OECD paper, Bullying in Education, Prevalence, Impact and Responses across countries. It was released today, and of course there were loads of links in the chat as well, so loads of reading material to feast your eyes on. That's it for now though. Thanks again for everyone for joining, and I hope you join us again for another OECD webinar soon. All the best.